Good morning. Good to be here with each of you this morning. I'd like to say thank you to the congregation here for allowing me to speak. Of course, if you don't know me, my name is Isaac Hall. I'm best known as Jack Hall's grandson, even today, but I'm also the preacher at the Maple Avenue Church of Christ over in Lancaster, just a little ways from here. And I'd also like to say thank you because I was told by Mike that there were a lot of people here at Richmond that were clamoring to hear me, and for that I'd like to thank both of my grandparents. So it's very nice of them to ask me over here. This morning, if you want to open up to two places actually, we're going to be looking in Hebrews chapter 11 as well as Genesis around chapter 17 and a few other places. And we're going to take a look at those passages as we look at the life of Sarah, at least as much as we're told about her in the Bible. But as we start with that, let me tell you what happened yesterday. Yesterday was a long day because it was decided that we were going to have a yard sale, which anyone who's ever had a yard sale knows that that's a terrible idea, but we did it anyway. So in this yard sale, we spent the first 2 hours making $12. Which is a lot of money for all that time that we invested in it. But the rest of the day, we ended up making some 30, 40 times that amount. And so it worked out okay. At least we got rid of a lot of stuff, and we got a little bit of cash in return. But when we're talking about faith, as we're going to talk about Sarah's faith this morning, it happens very often that faith starts out as being almost non-existent. And eventually, even though there's just a little bit there, it ends up being something real, something tangible. And certainly that's going to be true of Sarah. Her faith starts out maybe at a $12 faith, but ends up much more valuable than that later on. And so we're going to take a look at Sarah's example of the faith that she had and what we learned from that. But like I said, we're going to take a little look in Genesis chapter 17. So in Genesis chapter 17, we're going to see a promise that is given from God, starting in verse 4. Genesis 17, verse 4, it says, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. And I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you." Now we know this promise. This is the promise in the Old Testament. This is the whole reason we call it the Old Covenant, because this is that covenant. God says, I will make a great people out of this one man. And he promises it to Abraham, and he promises it to each of his descendants after that point. And this promise is made for Abraham. And it wouldn't happen without Abraham, but guess who else it wouldn't have happened without? If Sarah is not part of this promise, then there are no people of Israel. If Sarah is not part of this promise, then there are no kings that will descend from Abraham. So Sarah is an equal part in God's plan here to fulfill this promise to his people, those who will become his people. And God does this fairly often in the Bible. When we look at Adam and Eve, or we look at Ruth and Boaz, we see it's not one person that fulfills God's promise, but it's a couple that many times is responsible. And so it is here. But we see with Sarah and with Abraham that they start out, like we said, with very little faith. And their lack of faith is pretty obvious, but Sarah, for her part, started out not by showing great faith, but instead we know what she did. We know that she's famous for laughing when God said that she would have a child. The question, though, is why Sarah laughed. And I think for a long time, for myself personally, and maybe for a lot of you, that when we look at this story and we kind of glance through it, we say, okay, Sarah laughed. Well, of course she laughed, because God was telling a 90-year-old woman that she was going to give birth to a child. Well, that just doesn't happen. It's preposterous. Why would she even want to believe that? So she laughs, because it's such an absurd thing for God to tell her, right? Well, the text tells us why she laughed. So let's look in Genesis chapter 18 in verse 10, starting in verse 10. Genesis 18, starting in verse 10. It says, And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. And therefore Sarah laughed within herself. But she didn't just laugh. The text says, she laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? Why did Sarah laugh? It's not because she thought it was preposterous. She did. It's not because she thought it was a crazy idea. Instead, it says that she laughed, or the word can be translated as mocked or scornfully laughed at. It's because when she heard this promise, she said, now God is going to grant the one thing I've wanted for 90 years. Saying, I've been infertile for 90 years. I've not gotten a child, the one thing I desire in life, and now God's going to make that happen? Yeah, right. That's just not how it's going to work for me. She says, why would God make me happy after all these years? And so she laughs, not in a humorous way and not even just in a way that thinks this is absurd, but she laughs because she's in pain. The bitterness that comes from infertility is the laughter that she has here. But she laughs. Well, why did she laugh? She laughs, one, because she knows that she has been barren, as Genesis would put it in Genesis 11, verse 30, her entire lifetime. So why would that change now? She knows that she's not been able to have a child, probably in spite of trying for a long time, and she's discouraged, but also, of course, because of her age. Sarah is getting up there in years. We're told that she is 90 years old at this point. That is pretty old, but of course we know in the Old Testament, we know in Genesis, that there were people that lived pretty long. In fact, Sarah would live pretty long. She would live to be 127 years old. So maybe it's not out of the realm of possibility, except that it still really is in human terms. As a comparison, if we use our lifespan today, our expected lifespan, and we compare that with Sarah's expected lifespan, well, we would see that she had a child when she was 70% of the way through her lifespan, which means for you would be having a child at 56 years old. Does that sound a little bit terrifying? Does that sound like it's absolutely impossible? Well, with God, of course, it is possible, but she was too old to have a child. It says she was beyond her childbearing years in the text. And because of that, when God says you're going to have a child, she laughs at God. She mocks God even to an extent to say, yeah, right. Why would that happen to me now? Why would I find pleasure after all of these years of pain? And her lack of faith then is even more obvious because she tries a different method. She and Abraham agree to this, but they try to use Hagar to produce offspring for them instead. Now that is people trying to fix God's plan. It's amazing how often we catch ourselves doing the same thing. It's kind of like old people with cell phones. You try to fix something you don't understand fully. Or it's kind of like young people, too, when they try to fix a VCR. I guess that might be dated. But with us trying to fix God's plans, it reminds me back of the apostles. Whenever Jesus is going to feed the 5,000, he asked them, how are we going to feed these people? And they say, well, we don't have enough money, and even if we did, there's nowhere to buy food here, so we're going to have to send them home. And Jesus says, no, I'll take care of it. With God, it would be impossible, with humans, it would be impossible. With God, it is fully possible. But still, the situation for Abraham and Sarah is trying to take something that God has planned out and trying to fix it with our own means. It never works out the way we expect. But back in Genesis chapter 11, back in Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 11, Hebrews 11, verse 11, it tells us the faith that Sarah does develop. So we've seen now that she didn't start out with this faith. In fact, she laughed at the idea that God could even do something this great. And yet, the text here in Hebrews says she did have faith. In fact, she had pretty great faith. to be recorded here, but it says what she did by her faith. So what did she do? She did a couple things. It says by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. What does that mean? It means faith was what allowed her, by God working through her, it allowed her to become pregnant. So God was part of even that, the first part of the miracle of life that took place for Sarah to have a child. So it was by faith that this took place. Beyond this, though, it says that she received strength to bear a child when she was past the age. So her faith not only allowed her to become pregnant, but it also allowed her to carry a child and to give birth to a child, even when that should have been an impossibility. But her faith allowed her to do that. It says at the end of the verse here that she judged him, that is God, faithful, who had promised this to her. She judged that God was faithful. Sarah's whole situation is messed up by what she believes versus what God believes. And when she's relying on what she sees in front of her and what she is able to understand, her faith is very limited. But when she relies on God, everything changes. But her faith, her judging him faithful, apparently, or seems to have happened during that year. That 1 year between the time that God promised that they would have a child and then the time that they had a child. And I think I've got an idea of why that faith was built. Can you imagine the morning that a 90-year-old woman woke up and she had morning sickness? Can you imagine the feelings that she had whenever she started to realize this is real? I am actually pregnant. I'm actually going to have a child that God has promised. And imagine the conviction that comes with that. To say, okay, my entire life I've wanted one thing, it's not been given to me, but now God is making it happen. At a time I thought that it was absolutely impossible. So with her faith then, her faith is sort of a Thomas faith. Thomas, we blame him a lot for being doubting. All the apostles doubted in turn, but with Thomas, his faith goes from nothing. His faith goes from I need to see the physical evidence, just like the case of Sarah, to eventually being stronger than anyone else's faith. And I think, pretty sure, whenever Sarah started to experience maybe the first signs of pregnancy, or maybe once she'd given birth to a healthy child, that she said, "My Lord and my God," as Thomas did when he realized the amount of belief that was produced by seeing what God could do. And so she believes, not because of what she can do. When we lack faith, it's usually because it's thinking, oh, well, what can I do to fix the situation? Well, that doesn't matter. It's not about what I can do. It's not about what I can see either, but it's about who God is. If I see who God is, then my faith in him can allow him to do whatever he wants to in my life. But as a result of this faith, as the text in verse 12 says, it says, "Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the sea." Sarah's faith allowed not just her to receive blessing, but blessings for all time to all people. It produced God's people, the people of Israel, and beyond that, it would produce even the Savior of the world through her lineage. She would become the ancestor to Christ, which means she's a crucial part of God's plan to save not just the Jews, but to save us. God probably could have found a different way, but God uses Sarah. He chooses Sarah and Abraham to carry out his promise because she judged him faithful who had made that promise. So what do we learn as a result of looking at Sarah? That's always the question. It's good to look at any text of Scripture. It's good to study through. It's good to look through, to learn from. But without application, it's still just study. It's just there. It's just knowledge. But how do we apply that knowledge to us? A few things. First, let's go back to Genesis 18. We're going to look at one more passage. verses 13 and 14. So back in Genesis chapter 18, a little bit after the text that we read, starting in verse 13, it says, "And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I surely bear a child since I am old? And then God asked a question. God says, Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son." Let me ask that question to you. And this requires a verbal response from you. The question is, from Genesis chapter 18, verse 14, is anything too hard for the Lord? That was a little wimpy. We're going to do that again. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Even the situation of Sarah, a 90-year-old woman giving birth, impossible for us, easy for God. Nothing is too difficult. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. So the first lesson then is that all things are possible with God, but then more directly to us, the question is, what is it in my life that I look at and I see, well, God has made a promise to me about this, but yeah, right, that can't happen. There's no way God's going to fulfill that promise to me, maybe to someone else. But the question is, what do I laugh at? In my life, what is it that I say, that's too big, it's too hard for God to do, and I laugh it off as something that just can't happen? Well, that's where faith comes in. Second lesson we can learn here is that faith means believing that God will make good on his promises. Back in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, we know this text. We see it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Faith is not about what we see in front of us. Faith is about what God can do for us. Faith means that we don't trust just the things that we have in our power, just the things that we are capable of, and just the things that we can see in our life. Again, Sarah, she looks at her situation. Faith isn't based on what's seen, but she looks at her situation and says, I'm 90 years old. This can't happen. I've never seen another 90-year-old woman get pregnant and give birth. That just doesn't take place. And from all my experience, that can't happen. But with God, that doesn't matter. My experience, what I can see, it just doesn't matter. Because faith goes beyond that. Faith is the substance of what's hoped for. Certainly Sarah hoped for this, but it's the evidence of things that we can't see. It's the things that she couldn't see that God could, that he made happen. Another lesson. I always love this lesson, in any lesson. But this lesson is, it's never too late. Isn't that a good lesson anytime? It's never too late. It's not too late if you are 90 years old. If you're 90 years old, you may not have a child today, although you can't laugh it off or you'll be in Sarah's situation. But at the same time, Sarah was 90 and she was just starting her life as a mother. Sounds a little terrifying, but at the same time, it's amazing that God made that happen. And at the same time, Sarah is 90 years old, and she is just now becoming a full part of God's plan to save the world at 90 years old. There's no age that is too old to start something. A couple weeks ago, we also had a lesson at Maple Avenue on the book of Esther, and we mentioned there that most scholars agree that Esther was probably around 14 years old when that book takes place. It doesn't matter which end of the spectrum you're on. If you're 14 or if you're 90, it doesn't have any effect on God's plan, because God can use any person who's willing to serve. Another lesson that we see is that being a godly parent, not just a good parent, but being a godly parent begins well before your child is ever born. In some cases, it starts 90 years before your child is born. Sarah, I don't think it was God's plan all along for Sarah to be barren just for this to happen, but at the same time, the one benefit we see for Sarah is that she has 90 years of experience. She has 90 years of patience in dealing with the frustrations of her heart not getting her desire, and because of that, she's able to be a good parent, a godly parent, one that still makes mistakes, but a parent that was prepared to be part of God's plan at that point. Again, not relying on herself, but relying on God. The last lesson is this. This text for today comes from Hebrews chapter 11. We call it different things. I think a lot of people call it the Hall of Fame of Faith. That's probably a mouthful, but it does give a nice description of what this chapter is. But this chapter is amazing because it's not just a chapter of faith. That would be nice. A lot of people say, oh, it's a chapter of action. Well, it is. That's true too. What I think is the most incredible thing about it, it's a chapter of grace. Why? Well, because in this story, we get people like Sarah. Was Sarah perfect? No. Sarah laughed, she mocked, she scorned God for even suggesting something so painful to her. And yet, she's included not for laughing, not because she disbelieved in God, but she's included in this group of faithful individuals for her faith. You don't have to remember her for laughing. You remember her because she was faithful to God in spite of everything she thought. But we see other people in this chapter as well. We see Abraham, of course, included. Was Abraham perfect? No, I think he lied about his wife once or twice, being his sister, kind of a weird situation. We remember Moses as well. Was Moses perfect? He didn't even get to enter the promised land. He wasn't perfect. David's included in this chapter. That seems kind of strange. We know about his sin. And Rahab is included in this chapter. And what does it matter? It doesn't matter what they did in the past. It doesn't matter who they were before. But the beauty of grace is that these people are remembered for one thing, which is their faith in spite of everything else they did wrong. And the beauty of God is He will view us the same way. Not because of what I've done, because what I've done isn't good enough to get me anywhere, but because of faith in Him, He has grace toward us. And so, we're able to be recorded for our faith, for our good, rather than all the bad that we've done. But this morning, if this whole lesson does anything, let it remind you of one example of faith, of which there are many examples in the Bible, but one example this morning, that of Sarah, who had faith that God would keep His promises. And this morning, with that faith in Him, it may be necessary for us to restore our faith if we've wavered. It may be necessary for us to be faithful for the first time. That happens through obedience to God. It can't happen any other way. This morning, if you need to be obedient to Him, becoming a child of His, this is the time to do that. This morning, if there's anything else that the Richmond church can help you with, they'll be more than happy to help you. Anything we can do, if you are willing, as we stand, as we sing.